What is going on, everyone? So this week's video is going to be a composition review of the 3 photos I shot on my recent backpacking trip to southern Utah. Let's start with this photo right here. This is the first photo I shot on the trip, and it's actually a specific scene that I returned to this canyon to photograph. I've tried on 2 prior occasions to photograph this scene. It just didn't turn out quite right. And the main thing is that this is one of those subjects where if you slide the camera a ½ inch to the right or to the left, it has a pretty profound difference on the overall impact of the composition and of the photo. So to set this up a little bit, this wall is not directly behind that bush. There's probably about at least 20 feet, maybe 30 feet between this bush and the wall. What happens is that this is growing on this little rise that's covered in grass here. Then it drops down, you go back about 20, 30 feet, and then there's a wall back there. So that means that the alignment between the bush and the wall, as you slide from side to side, it shifts a fair amount. And one of the things I really loved about this scene were these 3 bright streaks here in the desert varnish. I like the overall color of the desert varnish. I like the color of this bush, which I looked up. It's actually it's kind of like an oak tree, but like a scrub sort of oak tree. But I liked how I was able to align it within the dark area of the desert varnish here. I like the color contrast between the wall and the tree there. And I wanted to include a fair amount of foreground because it helps to ground the composition. It gives a sense of scale, and also it ties into the warm streaks there. So it kind of creates this cohesive whole. Now in the past, what didn't work so well for me on the scene is that my camera was shifted a little bit to the side and the bush had an awkward alignment to the wall in the background. So what I was paying really close attention to was basically this edge right here and where this relates to that, and then this edge right here and how that relates to this wall. So I wanted the bush to be relatively contained within this dark area and centered within this dark area. So you get these nice little streaks coming up from it, and it's just centered really nicely in there. The other thing I was paying really close attention to was this little section right here and how this sticks into that light area, and have about a similar size of the bush, a similar portion of the bush kind of poking into the light area over here. So it was literally me sliding the camera just a little bit to the side. And one thing that's fairly unique about large format is that it's really hard to dial in a specific composition because it's hard to see the whole subject at once. I was using a relatively long lens. It's a really slow lens. The ground glass is very, very faint. And you actually have to move your head around to see each part of the composition. You can't see it all at once. And so what I do is I start by trying to figure out where exactly where that camera needs to be by kind of sliding to the side, just looking with my eyes to figure out where the camera needs to be. And then I go ahead and I set up the camera at that specific spot, and then I can look at the ground glass, make sure I did pretty well for the alignment. But at that point, once that camera is set up exactly where it needs to be, now I pay attention to the edges. So I start by positioning the camera where it needs to be, then I determine the composition by looking at the edges and kind of shifting the camera either way. Now there's a couple of things I was working with here. I wish I had more space on the right side. I wish I had a little more of the dark area of the sandstone over there, and there was more area to work with, but the tricky thing was on this side. So if I simply shifted my camera and just aimed it a little bit more to the right, I'll get more of that, but that sends the bush a little further off to the left. And it ends up being kind of an awkward alignment because that bush starts creeping a little bit too close to the edge, which builds more tension, which I really didn't want the photo to have. I did do a slight crop to this. So right out of camera, you see I had a little bit more space there on the bottom. I had a little bit more space on the left side. So by bringing up the bottom of the photo, bringing in the side, I was able to redefine this side over here. And I think by putting this light area here kind of close to the edge, it helps to balance a little bit from the other side there. So I always do like to give myself a little more composition at the bottom than I truly need, because I find that that usually ends up being the proper amount, and I can always crop in on it a little bit if need be. So that's how I did there for this particular photo, and overall I'm quite happy with how this one turned out. So it was definitely well worth it to head back to that location to try to get this final photo of it there. This one. So this is just the the curled dried mud at the base of a boulder. Now, one thing that's really interesting about this scene is that this is located only about 10 feet away from a photo I shot 2 years prior of a base of a sandstone wall with this cool lightning bolt looking fracture in it. It's right where these boulders kind of fell down into the wash. And this is right at the base of those boulders, and just on the other side is where that fractured photo is, which is kind of crazy that you can go into this canyon, hike for miles and miles and miles, but then you find two photos right next to each other on different years, and that's one of the reasons why I love returning to a location. But this scene this is just pure chaos. There was a distraction immediately outside the frame on this side, and there was a distraction immediately outside the frame on this side. Some kind of like larger rocks there. And those were things that I was working with, and so I'm just trying to show just the middle portion of it there. We have the blue skylight coming down from here. You have some light reflected in from a boulder there, so it's classic reflected light. Two different colors of light coming from two different directions, which just gives so much life to the scene. And I had to do a little bit of front tilt, a little bit of swing, so the plane of focus kind of followed the slope, because it was all sloping down to the low point right there. So I was pretty happy with how that one turned out. In terms of Photoshop stuff, I basically just reduced the magenta cast, and then that's basically all I really had to do for that. But I was really happy with that one. That was my favorite photo from the trip, and it's a scene I very easily could have simply walked right past. So that's definitely why it's important to keep your head on a swivel, look around everywhere, and stay curious about your surroundings. And if you do see something that grabs your attention, spend the time, set up a photo, because could result in something kind of cool like this. And then this one now. So this is a photo looking up at this arch that's forming. And I mentioned in the film reveal video about how when I was composing this photo, I didn't even notice this, which is kind of bizarre, because now that I look at this, I can't help but just see this wonderful arch form. But I think when I was looking at it in person, I was more focused on this area right in here and the interaction between that and the tree. This diagonal line here, this is something that I didn't want this to awkwardly cut through the tree. So I moved forward and backwards. Then you have basically the tree kind of coming up in the composition versus dropping back. So just like with that first scene, you move through the scene, you try to figure out specifically where the camera needs to be placed in order to align everything as well as possible. And I do like the way that this drops down. It gives a little bit more visual weight to this tree, but I wish I had more space up there at the top. I think that would avoid, because you have this this point where this arch comes up really close to the top edge of the photo. Anytime you have a subject near the edge of a photo, it's going to build tension, especially since this curves upward. It's really building a lot of tension right up in there. And if I had moved the camera up a little bit to have a little more breathing space up there, I would have helped to minimize that point of tension. It also would have chopped off a little bit down here. So this is a scene where I look forward to returning to this scene. And I guess in a perfect world, I like a little bit more up top, but still maintain this, which might mean stepping back a little bit. But when you do that, it will change the relationship between this tree and that. And then the other concern I had when I was photographing this is that to my eye, it was almost monotone with a lot of sort of orangey red tone. You didn't have a lot of color differentiation. Now, this is where the magic of film helped me out here. So you notice that we actually pick up some blue tone up here, some light reflected from the sky. You pull out some blue tone in here. And so even though to my eye, it didn't seem like it had a lot of depth to it, when you photograph it on film, film's gonna pull out those cool blue tones, which helps to build some degree of depth. So I think this is definitely a scene to return to whenever I make it back to this canyon, possibly in the fall, we'll see. But I'd like to give this another go and pay a little more attention to the top of the composition while still trying to maintain that stuff down there. But overall, I was decently happy with the results, given that I only really photographed 3 different scenes. And it was pretty cool to have you know, 2 shots have definitely made my way to my portfolio, and then this one gives me an excuse to go back to the canyon and see what else I could find. But yeah, it was an interesting trip, and hopefully I'll be able to get out on another trip here in the near future, and then we'll see. Hopefully Zion will be here right around the corner. But I want to thank everyone for watching, and we'll see you around next time.